Well, thank you so much for having me today. Let's see if I can, oh, excellent. Slides are moving, it looks like. Is that right? Okay. Jan, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me and everything? Okay, great. Never know if I'm talking into the void. All right, so as mentioned, I'm going to be doing sort of updates on COVID-19 and particularly focused on the transplant population today. And I'm going to be giving sort of, medical overview. And then as Jan mentioned, she's going to sort of come back at the end to talk about, sort of operationally, what does, these changes and updates mean for you all. This is sort of, how things look in Pennsylvania at the moment, the most recent COVID-19 numbers. And as I'm sure you're all very much aware, things are in a much better place now than they were earlier in the pandemic. This was sort of our biggest peak this winter, and we've had sort of a steady decrease through the spring and then the summer, leading to a lot of reopenings, which are sort of marked by these green dash lines. So despite sort of progressive reopenings this spring, we've continued to have a decline in COVID-19 cases here in Pennsylvania and in most parts of this country. And the main reason for that, of course, is the more widespread availability of vaccination for COVID-19. So this, all the maps I think I see now are, instead of looking at COVID-19 cases, are now looking at COVID-19 vaccination rates. So you can see here, we're doing pretty well in Pennsylvania. About 44% of all adults in Pennsylvania are vaccinated. And if you look at folks who are 65 and older, it's quite a bit higher than that. It's more in the 60-ish percentile. And in Philadelphia, actually, the percentage of adults who are fully vaccinated is a bit higher than the overall state, currently around 56%. Notably, of course, the rates of vaccination are much lower in children, since it's only even available for children who are above the age of 12. And so, all of the, toddlers and smaller children, of course, are not yet vaccinated. So worth remembering, there's a big part of the population that's not actually included, in these numbers. So I wanted to spend a lot of our time today talking about the COVID-19 vaccine, since this seems to be where a lot of the questions come up, and they really inform kind of what we're able to do currently and safely. So just to sort of review the vaccines in general, and then I'm going to move to talking about how they work in transplant patients in particular. So there's 3 that are approved in the United States, though they're approved under this emergency use authorization. So it's not quite the same as being kind of fully approved. They're still under investigation theoretically, though I know at least Pfizer has applied for full approval at this point. So the 3 that you probably have all heard about, because they're approved here in the US, are the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, and then the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. There are, of course, many others that are being developed or even approved in other countries. Some of the other ones that you've probably heard a lot about are the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which is not approved in the United States, but is used or has been used relatively widely in Europe. And then Novavax, which is being developed here in the United States and is in sort of the final stages of testing, but is not yet approved either. So I want to talk about how these vaccines work for a moment. So the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines are both mRNA vaccines, as it's called, and then Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a little bit different, though they all work in fairly similar ways. So the Pfizer and the Moderna mRNA vaccines are the ones that you need 2 shots of. A lot of my patients know them as either the 2-shot or the 1-shot. So these are the 2 shots vaccines. And the way that these work is that the vaccine actually has this little bit of genetic material in this sort of oily shell, actually, that when injected, into your arm, goes into, the soft tissues there and the muscles, and comes in contact with your cells. And when it sees your cells, the cells actually take it up, and then they use that genetic material to produce some protein. And that protein is something that the COVID virus also produces, but it's not the actual virus. It's just a little tiny piece of that virus. And then these cells are able to show it to your immune system, this little bit of the virus, and your immune system can then react. And then when your immune system comes in contact with the real thing, the real virus, it says, oh, I recognize this, I know just what to do, and it can quickly sort of eliminate the virus and prevent you from even getting truly infected from it. So importantly, though, this little bit of sort of COVID genetic material does not affect your DNA or your genetic material at all. Your genetic material is in the nucleus of your cells, and this COVID genetic material doesn't even get into that section of the cell, so it doesn't come anywhere near your DNA. And importantly, it also cannot give you the virus itself, because it's just a little tiny snippet of the virus that's included here. It's not even close to sort of the whole thing. So you cannot get COVID from the vaccine itself. There's been a lot of sort of concern about how quickly, these vaccines were developed, and were they, fully vetted and that sort of thing. And I think it's worth knowing that although these vaccines were developed quite quickly, there had been sort of study of this type of vaccine for many, many years, well over a decade before, this moment where we had to rapidly turn them into sort of a reality. And actually, there have been vaccines for mRNA that have been studied for things like the flu, Zika virus, rabies, and so on. And so although this is the first sort of approved mRNA vaccines, there definitely, it wasn't a technology that was just developed in the last year or anything like that. These mRNA vaccines, so the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, have turned out to be really quite effective, honestly, more effective than we even dreamed that they would be. In the clinical trials, at least, they showed over 90% efficacy at preventing any COVID infection, and basically 100% efficacy at preventing severe infection. And what this means, this 90% effective, sort of in real terms, means that if you have 100 people who would have gotten COVID-19 without the vaccine, then after the vaccine, actually only 10 people get COVID instead. So it really drastically reduces the rates of COVID. Now, I put an asterisk here because this is how it performed in the clinical trials, and the clinical trials did not include transplant patients or other folks who are on sort of immunosuppressive medications. And so this doesn't necessarily tell us exactly how it works in transplant patients, but we're gonna get to that in a minute. In the clinical trials, they saw some protection after even just the first dose, and then the full protection was reached about 2 weeks after that second dose. So that's where that guidance comes from, that after 2 weeks after your final dose, you are considered fully vaccinated. In terms of side effects of these mRNA vaccines, so the most common are those here on the left, which are pain and swelling and so on, where you get the shot itself, or symptoms that feel kind of like you have the flu, like you're tired, kind of achy, maybe even have a fever. Though all of these tend to resolve within about 2-ish days after you're receiving the vaccine. There have been some other side effects reported that are potentially more serious, though fortunately have been quite rare. The first one that was noted were these allergic reactions, even some cases of anaphylaxis, which is the most severe kind of allergic reaction. Fortunately, though, very treatable. No one has suffered any sort of long-lasting sort of illness because of this, and no deaths were reported from anaphylaxis here, though can be sort of a serious medical problem. There's also been reports of COVID arm, where a week or two after, particularly the Moderna vaccine, some people get a sort of large red swelling of their arm where they got the shot that can last for a good week or two. That is also a type of allergic reaction, but it's not of the sort of serious type. It's not the kind that progresses to anaphylaxis. So people with COVID arm are fine to get additional shots if needed for COVID, whereas the anaphylaxis type reactions would be a reason to not get future mRNA vaccines. The other side effect that the CDC is honestly still looking into are these reports of what we call myocarditis or pericarditis, which are the medical terms for having inflammation of the heart or the lining around the heart. And generally these cause chest pain. That's the primary symptom, sometimes some shortness of breath. And basically what's happened is that there's been an uptick of these cases of this inflammation of the heart in young men 16 to 30 years old, generally within a few days of getting their second dose of one of these mRNA vaccines. And there's been more of this than usual. And so that's sort of led the CDC and FDA to start looking into whether this is definitely linked to the vaccine or not. Luckily, it is, quite rare. There's been about 300 total reports of this so far, which sounds like a lot, but when you think about the millions and millions of people that have been vaccinated, it works out to be, a tiny percentage. Though if you narrow this down to, men in this age group, it's higher than that. But I think we don't yet know what the real sort of rate of this is and whether it's definitely linked in all cases to the vaccine. But I think I suspect we're going to hear more about this. The CDC is still investigating, and I think they will, because of the benefit of the COVID vaccine and the fact that most patients who have developed this sort of heart inflammation have done just fine. Ultimately, my guess is it won't stop them from recommending the vaccine, but it may recommend that if you get chest pain after the vaccine to get, follow up quickly. All right, so those are the mRNA vaccines. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a little bit different, though similarities and differences. So this is the one-shot vaccine. This one works a little bit differently in that it's not delivered to the cells in that little oily shell, but similar to the other vaccines, you again have a little bit of this genetic material that encodes for a protein that is on COVID that gets delivered to your cells. And in this case, actually what delivers it to your cells from the vaccine in your arm is actually another virus called adenovirus. But this virus is modified such that it's not a live virus and it's not something that can make you sick, but it's very good at getting into your cells. So it's a good way to deliver this little bit of genetic material to your cells, and then your cells transcribe it, and similar to the other vaccines, it then allows your immune system to get a preview of just a little tiny piece of COVID, but a piece that your immune system could then recognize if it came in contact with the real COVID virus. It again does not affect your DNA in any way, and again it just encodes for a tiny piece of the COVID virus, so you cannot get the virus from this vaccine. And relevant to the transplant recipients in the audience, although it is again, delivered by this adenovirus vector, as we call it, you cannot, this is not a live virus vaccine, so you cannot get adenovirus illness or COVID illness from this vaccine. So it's okay even if you're immunosuppressed. This vaccine was quite effective in clinical trials, not quite as impressive as the mRNA vaccine numbers, but about 72% effective at preventing COVID here in the US. When it was trialed in other countries where they have some of these other COVID variants, it was less effective than that. But again, honestly, 72% effective is what we were hoping for originally, and then the mRNA vaccines just happened to kind of exceed our expectations in terms of efficacy. And similar to the mRNA vaccines, you're considered fully protected after 2 weeks-ish, about after that one dose. In terms of side effects of this vaccine, so in general, patients have reported less in the way of the arm pain and those flu-like symptoms than what we saw with the mRNA vaccines. But there has been sort of one notable side effect with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and that is of blood clots. So in April, the CDC and FDA actually recommended pausing the use of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because they'd had a handful of predominantly young women who have developed these blood clots in the setting of low platelets. And the medical term for this is this long word abbreviated as TTS. And again, was mostly in young women and 1 or 2 weeks after the vaccine, so a little bit of a delay. Again, it's quite rare. We've only had 28 cases so far, which when you think about the millions of people who have had the vaccine, that's not so bad. But some of these cases have actually led to death. And so although rare, it is a significant side effect. And so Although the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is still being administered in the US, the CDC cautions that women who are less than 49 years old may have a slightly increased risk of blood clots with this vaccine. And so it might be a reason to consider if you're at high risk of blood clots, receiving one of the other vaccines that's available. One of the most common questions that I get currently is whether I think there's going to be any long-term side effects from these vaccines. And I, of course, can't be sure of anything per se, but we don't expect to see any sort of long-term side effects where having received the vaccine leads to sort of a long-term health problem. And that's mostly because with all the other vaccines that you and I, have received in life, almost all of the side effects happen within about 6 weeks of receiving the vaccines. And although these mRNA vaccines are a little bit different than what we've used in the past, they aren't so different that we would expect, more consequences, more than a couple months out from the vaccine. And the FDA requires that each vaccine be studied for at least 2 months after that final dose, because most of these side effects happen in those first 6 weeks. And so they don't approve anything unless they've seen at least 8 weeks of follow-up. And we do have, many people now, myself included, who are, more than 6 months out from when they first got their vaccine, and we haven't at least had any reports of any notable long-term side effects come up. The CDC, of course, continues to monitor things. They're not going to, just stop looking at the 6-week mark, but so far there haven't been any notable signals. All right, so turning now to the transplant population, which of course I think is why many of you are here. Why, to sort of take a step back, why might the vaccines work differently in transplants recipients? The main reason is because of immunosuppression, which transplant recipients of course take to prevent rejection of their organ. And the reason immunosuppression can affect how vaccines work is that we're relying on an immune response in order to get protection. So when you get that shot, we're trying to rev up the immune system and get it to look at that little bit of the virus protein that I talked about and respond to it, so that when it comes in contact with the real virus, it can remember what to do and it knows what to do. If you're on immunosuppressive medications, then when you get the vaccine, it may not sort of rev up your immune system as much, because we're suppressing that purposefully with the prednisone and tacrolimus and so on. And so that on the one hand makes it less likely that you'll have terrible side effects from the vaccine, but it also may reduce how much protection you have from the vaccine, because if the vaccine doesn't rev up your immune system enough, then your immune system won't know what to do when coming in contact with the real virus. All right, so what do we know so far about how these vaccines do in transplant patients? So we're slowly getting, or not slowly, rapidly getting more and more information about this. And I'm going to show you sort of what we know so far, but I would say stay tuned, because this, information keeps changing on a weekly, if not, daily basis. So this, what I've described in all these words on this slide, is the study done by the Hopkins group, where they looked at transplant patients who've had 2 doses of the mRNA vaccine, so either Pfizer or Moderna, and then checked their blood to see if they'd made a response to the vaccine by measuring their antibody level to COVID. And what they found is in 658 patients, transplant patients, about 54% of them had a detectable antibody response after 2 shots, so after the full vaccine series. They noted that the response was sort of better, quote unquote, in that there's more antibodies present when the patients were not on one of these anti-metabolite drugs, which is like Cellcept, mycophenolate, or azathioprine. And I think one of the more important things from my point of view is that they didn't find any new side effects. So it was the same sort of constellation of, sore arms, fatigue, muscle aches, that kind of thing. The common side effects that they saw in the general population of clinical trials, they similarly saw in transplant patients. And if anything, the side effects were slightly blunted, actually. So we didn't see any sort of new or scary side effects from the vaccine in this group of transplant patients. Now, importantly, this study, so, I think a lot of transplant patients have been a little bit discouraged by this number of 54%, in that it, that sort of makes it look like it's a 50-50 shot, whether you're actually getting any protection from the vaccine or not. And I would encourage you to be a little more optimistic about it than that, just because, one, we don't actually know whether the antibody level measured in your blood correlates with protection from the virus. What we really want to know is, once transplant patients have been vaccinated, how many actually still get COVID? And that doesn't answer this question, or this study doesn't answer that question. It just says what we measured in the blood. And there are parts of the immune system that protect you against COVID after a vaccine that they didn't measure in this study. And so this is like a piece of the picture, but it's not, definitely doesn't tell us everything we need to know. I do think it suggests that, transplant patients probably need to remain a little more cautious than, someone who's not immunosuppressed, even after being fully vaccinated, while we figure out sort of more information. But I wouldn't necessarily go much further than that. That same group at Hopkins also published a small study of just 30 patients where they tried giving a third dose of vaccine to see if those who had not really responded to the first 2 shots, if they responded to a third shot. Now, this was sort of a hodgepodge of vaccinations, in that they had these 30 patients who are transplant recipients who hadn't responded much to the first 2 shots. And for the third shot, though, they got all sorts of different things. Some of them got a Johnson & Johnson vaccine, some of them got an mRNA vaccine, some stuck with the same brand as before, some switched brands. So that third shot was sort of a heterogeneous approach. But what they saw was that 10 people, which is a third of them in this case, who hadn't had much of a response to the vaccine after 2 shots, did have detectable antibody levels after the third shot. Some proportion, responded to a third shot after not having responded to 2. Though 20 of these 30 patients still did not have an antibody response detected. They did have one patient who had rejection after the third shot, which is notable because we always worry that when we give a vaccine and rev up the immune system, that it's going to sort of misfire and start, causing rejection of the organ. But the authors, at least, did not think that this rejection episode was necessarily linked to the vaccine, though not sure there's any way to prove that. This study, I think, suggests that a booster shot may increase the number of people who are sort of more fully protected among transplant patients. Though again, this is a very small group of people, and they got all sorts of different kind of protocols here. And so it doesn't yet tell us, I think, what exactly the right thing is to do. And then I, right before coming online, actually, I added this slide in because this was literally just published online yesterday in the New England Journal. And I did want to mention it because I think it's important. It was a report from actually a group in France where my understanding is the French sort of authorities and, the equivalent of the CDC in France actually decided that they would give 3 doses, like a booster shot of the mRNA vaccines to their solid organ transplant recipients in France. So about 100 or so French solid organ transplant recipients were given 3 doses of the vaccine. And this is looking at their antibody response. And all you really need to take away from this is that it keeps going up. And actually, after the 3rd dose, they had almost 70% or so that did have antibodies, suggesting protection. Now, again, all they checked here was antibodies. It wasn't, the full spectrum of the immune system. But this suggested that a booster shot with one of the mRNA vaccines does increase, the number of transplant patients who have protective levels of antibodies. And importantly, in this study, they did not see any cases of rejection after that 3rd shot. So suggesting, and this is by no means sort of the be all and end all of information about this, because it was only about 100 or so patients, but suggesting that a 3rd shot may be safe and may be helpful in improving protection rates in transplant patients. So I wanted to highlight this here. This is the AST, the American Society of Transplantation, recommendations about COVID vaccination. And I wanted to highlight this because this is something that's been updated, almost monthly since, the vaccines became available in December. And I suspect they will update it again soon based on the results of those couple of studies I mentioned. In general, I think certainly our group at Penn, and I think a lot of groups nationally sort of follow these guidelines from the American Society of Transplantation about what we recommend for transplant patients. And this is what they say at present. I'm not going to read all of it to you, but essentially we're recommending that all recipients and candidates get vaccinated, if possible. And we don't see any side effects that suggest that it's more dangerous in transplant patients than in the general population. They do highlight, though, that we're not sure exactly how well protected transplant patients are after being fully vaccinated. And so to remain cautious and to continue to use some of the extra precautions like masks and social distancing, even if you've been fully vaccinated. And one thing they highlight is to make sure that the people around, vulnerable folks, so, the caregivers and the household members of those who are, transplant recipients do get vaccinated, because if a transplant patient's social circle is all vaccinated, that protects them as well. As of May 17th, they were not recommending checking antibodies or, giving third shots of the vaccine, but because we just didn't know enough about it. But I would certainly continue to check in on those recommendations, since I wouldn't be surprised if they evolve or change in the near future. And then importantly, we don't want people to change their immunosuppression at the time of vaccination unless it's recommended specifically by your transplant provider. We had some patients who wanted to come off their CellCept, before vaccination because of that potential relationship. But God forbid we precipitate rejection right before you get your COVID vaccine, that could make everybody worse off rather than better off. So I wanted to mention sort of two other sort of general topics, and that is breakthrough infections and variants, because these are the other things that we get a lot of questions about. So breakthrough infections are what people have started calling the COVID infections that people get after being fully vaccinated. This is, of course, what we're really interested in. We want to know, in our, say, transplant patients or other, people who are more vulnerable after they've been vaccinated, how many of them still get COVID and how severe is it? So what we're really interested in is understanding breakthrough infection rates in immunosuppressed patients. And so far, there's been about 10,000 breakthrough infections reported, which, again, sounds sort of high and concerning, but when you think about the hundreds of millions of people vaccinated, it's actually less than 1%. So it's actually even better than what we saw in the clinical trials. And only about 10% of those breakthrough infections have been, of the variety that require hospitalization, and only 2% have led to death. So when you're talking about serious COVID infections after vaccination, it's exceedingly rare, 0.0025%. So a number that's hard to even kind of understand because it's so small. We don't know if it is actually more common in immunosuppressed patients or not, though that is what we're trying to understand. And the worry is that it could be if immunosuppressed patients are not quite as well protected by the 2 vaccine shots, or 1 in the case of Johnson & Johnson. This isn't, though, a failure of the vaccine. We don't expect the vaccine to be 100%, effective at preventing infection. And in many ways, this is actually, although the news sort of sensationalizes these cases of COVID after vaccination, if anything, actually, we're seeing fewer breakthrough infections than we would have hoped. And it's been, exceedingly rare to see very severe infections after vaccination. And so that's been wonderful news, honestly. All right, so just one slide about the variants. I'll say, this is sort of a confusing and ever-changing topic. There's every time I think I have all the variants and their names and so on figured out, we change how we're referring to them. And some people call them by, B117, some call it the UK variant, some call it the alpha variants. I think, what we have learned so far is, one, that it's not surprising that there's variants. Viruses are constantly mutating, and this is to be expected. And there have been, hundreds of thousands of variants at this point. These few that we read about in the news are those that seem to be spreading sort of more easily and becoming more common in different parts of the world. And they may be, more transmissible and more contagious. It's unclear if they are, if they cause more serious illness or not. They tend to sort of come up in the setting of outbreaks when hospitals are strained and that sort of thing, and outcomes are generally worse when hospitals run out of, hospital beds. So I think we don't really know if any of them are particularly scarier, but they probably are more contagious. Importantly, though, one thing I wanted to highlight is that so far, all the studies have found that the currently authorized vaccines, the United States work on everything that's circulating here. So we don't have a variant right now that, evades all vaccine, protection. All right, so what is it safe for a vaccinated transplant person to do? This is definitely the million-dollar question, and I'm going to give you probably a pretty unsatisfying answer to this, because the truth is we're still trying to figure it out. I think our general takeaway is that the vaccine probably does protect transplant patients somewhat, but we don't know if it's as good as, in those clinical trials. And there's a chance that transplant patients aren't quite as well protected after vaccination. And so we are still recommending that transplant patients be a little more cautious than the average Joe. Now, that's probably not news. I think most transplant patients are more cautious already about, infectious threats, whether it's just the regular flu or something like that. So hopefully this is in vein with, the way that transplant patients already think about things. But so the CDC sort of officially says that people who have a condition or are taking medications that weaken the immune system should talk to their healthcare provider. So I guess that's me, to discuss their activities. I read that, I was like, oh, great. So they're going to leave it up to us. But they say they may need to keep taking all precautions to prevent COVID-19. So they hedge a little bit there. And so I think, at least at the moment, what our group has been sort of recommending, and the American Society of Transplantation has been recommending, is that transplant patients get vaccinated, but even after doing that, act as if you aren't vaccinated, in the sense of trying to continue using masks even when maybe they aren't required. So if you're with people who aren't vaccinated, or aren't in your household and you don't know if they're vaccinated or not, to use masks in those settings. Though with the caveat that we have definitely found that sort of outdoor activities, almost never, have we had outbreaks related to sort of outdoor gatherings. And so I think, the outdoors is definitely a sort of safe thing to do, but officially we're sort of, recommending masks regardless of vaccination status when you're with people who you don't know if they're vaccinated or not. Still recommend washing your hands, of course. And the one thing I did want to highlight, so related to what I was saying about outdoors being safer, is that I think what we have seen, over the many months now, is that probably the single highest risk thing to do is to be in sort of an indoor crowded place, particularly with a crowd who isn't wearing masks. So, like very crowded bars or restaurants, that kind of thing seems to be where COVID can cause an outbreak. So I think if I were, a transplant recipient, this would probably be the number one thing I would continue to avoid doing, is those sort of crowded indoor events, as opposed to sort of, outdoor things, which appear to be quite a bit safer. This is the COVID risk index, that we actually developed, I think, last summer before everyone had vaccines. I think it's still, relatively accurate. I think if you're, fully vaccinated and not immunosuppressed or a transplant patient, more of these things are probably low risk. But for the transplant recipients or people who are immunosuppressed, even if you're fully vaccinated, I would probably still think along these lines where it's probably, just fine to do things outdoors, but you might want to be more careful about sort of crowded indoor things like a large concert or something like that, where everyone else is not wearing a mask. And I have just a couple of final slides here before we can get to the sort of question and answer. So one specific thing that comes up a lot is about traveling in the United States in particular. So the sort of official rules are that, you don't have to do any testing before or after domestic travel. So if you want to fly from Philly to California, you don't technically, need to get tested before you fly, or before you come home. Masks are required for everyone on public transportation, regardless of vaccination status. So if you do, make such a flight, then you can be, relatively confident that everyone will be required to wear a mask around you. But I think that what we're still sort of recommending at the moment anyway is to try to sort of play it safe a little bit with traveling, in the sense of, if possible, sort of, drive in your own, vehicle or what have you, and avoid at least prolonged public transportation. So there's no set rules on this. And of course, if you're just taking the bus across town for 10 minutes or 30 minutes, that's not such a high risk exposure. But if you're doing, a 12-hour flight, across the world or something, that might be higher risk, though honestly, we don't know for sure. So, and then while you're away, it's important to try to stay with people either in your immediate household or people who are known to be sort of fully vaccinated. So to keep your ring around you sort of vaccinated or somewhat limited. So this last slide here is actually some questions that were submitted before the talk that I either don't think I answered directly in my slides, or I wanted to highlight and sort of answer again. And then after this, we'll open it up for any questions you all have thought of in the meantime. So one question was about whether you should get the vaccine if you're showing signs of rejection or on new anti-rejection medications. And so my thought on that is, so obviously it's definitely something you should just discuss with your own providers, because it depends very much on the precise situation. But in general, we have been giving the vaccine when people are typically when they're not in the midst of sort of a rejection episode or just getting started on new anti-rejection medicines for two reasons. One is that the new anti-rejection medications are typically added immunosuppression, and so it may suppress your response and thus your protection to the vaccine. And then the other thing is that the vaccine can give you symptoms that can mimic rejection, like low-grade fevers and that sort of thing. And so if you get the vaccine, it might be confusing to your providers whether the rejection is getting worse or it's just a side effect of the vaccine. So usually we have been giving those vaccines when folks are in a slightly more sort of steady state with their rejection medications. All right, the next one was about children returning to in-person school or employees returning to the office. So for the case of children returning to in-person school, assuming the child is not the transplant recipient here, but rather like the transplant recipient is a parent of a child who needs to go back to school. I'm guessing that's the scenario that people are referring to. I mean, I think that given the sort of low rates of COVID in the community, if children return to in-person school, as long as they follow sort of the mandates of the school, which to my knowledge still include masking and that sort of thing, since children are not vaccinated and it is an indoor sort of space with a number of different people. Basically the children would need to follow said precautions, but then I don't think that there's necessarily any reason for additional precautions in the home, unless the child becomes ill in any way. If the child becomes, feverish, that sort of thing, then you probably want to isolate the transplant recipient from the child until the child could get tested for COVID, and then sort of go from there. In terms of returning to work or to the office, so if this is the transplant recipient that we're talking about, I think it really depends on what work involves. Since work can range from an outdoors sort of job that I would say probably just fine, to something that's a densely populated indoor setting. And so I think depending on the person's degree of immunosuppression and what their job entails, the answer could range. So that one I would actually defer entirely to specific transplant providers to answer. In terms of advice on receiving 2 rounds of vaccinations, 2 doses of one brand and then 2 doses of another to promote antibodies. So at this point, that's not something I would recommend, since this really hasn't been studied at all. And we don't know if there could be harm from this, like, causing rejection. But as I mentioned, stay tuned, because I wouldn't be surprised if booster doses are recommended at some point. But we'd want to work out the safe way to do said boosters, what kind of booster, how soon after your most recent, your second shot, should you get a third one, that sort of thing. So I wouldn't do this on your own. I would say only consider that in like a research setting, if you're involved in one of the trials, like at Hopkins or something like that, or if it specifically becomes recommended in the future. Outside of the Hopkins study, what other transplant-related studies are there out there? So I mentioned the New England Journal publication from France that just came out yesterday. That's probably the one making the biggest splash, this week, but it literally changes constantly. So stay tuned. I will say there is one other study that was published that did evaluate some of those other parts of the immune system besides just the antibodies, and did find that transplant patients had responses to the vaccine in those other ways that would add protection. And so it does suggest that those antibody measurements are not the be all and end all of the protection from the vaccine. And then finally, what has been the experience of transplant recipients post-vaccination who have contracted COVID-19? So we don't have a large study of breakthrough infections in transplant patients as of yet. There's been a few case reports here and there, and I have seen myself some transplant patients who have been fully vaccinated and then developed COVID infection. And the main takeaway and sort of reassuring thing that I can tell you is that in large part, the infections have been quite mild, not requiring coming into the hospital. If they do come into the hospital, not needing much in the way of oxygen or that sort of thing. And so I do think, at least anecdotally, and based on these case reports, it looks like if you do get COVID-19 after getting vaccinated, it's generally more mild and not, a life-threatening concern like it is without the vaccine. All right, so why don't I stop there and turn it back over. I can answer questions and then turn it back over to Jan if that's what we'd like to do.
Well, that's great, Judith. I've been watching the question. Thanks everybody for putting them in. And Judith, you covered quite a few of them. There is an ongoing sort of thread of questions because of the terminology booster and third shot. And can you address the difference? And then also, sort of what you think is likely to happen as vis-a-vis transplant recipients, this for whatever that third shot.
Yeah. So I should say I've been using booster and third shot sort of interchangeably here. And that might not be totally accurate, but my prediction, though this is in no way official, nor am I, officially condoning it, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is eventually a recommendation for transplant patients to get additional shots. I think that may be true of everybody, if new shots are needed for different variants or that sort of thing. So I suspect there will there may be more COVID shots in the future for all of us. But I think that we're close, but we don't quite have enough information yet to know exactly how to do that, in terms of which vaccine should be the third dose. Should it be one of the mRNA ones, the Johnson & Johnson one? Are there scenarios where we shouldn't get a third shot because of, concern of rejection or something else? Or should the third shot be a lower dose because you don't need quite as much of a boost? These are, questions that we don't have answers to yet. So, but we'll come back and update you when we have official, recommendations.
Okay. Well, no, but I think it's helpful for everybody to know that there is no answer yet to that. So for those who put in questions about mixing, which would be the third dose, can you mix and match? So Dr. Anesi is saying, stay tuned for more information on that. There are a number of folks who in the chat shared, who are recipients, that they actually did have, were diagnosed as having COVID. And there's some questions sort of about, is there anything to share that you can share about recipients who had the virus subsequently received the vaccine? Anything about the vaccine's effectiveness or any research about sort of special information that might be applicable to that subgroup of folks?
So just to clarify, is it people who got COVID before they got vaccinated and they're wondering
Correct.
if they should get
They are
vaccinated?
recipients.
Okay.
They had COVID and they did subsequently get vaccinated. And I think it makes sense for you to say whether, if they haven't gotten vaccinated, I think I know what your position is, but it's probably worth repeating that as well.
Yes. Okay, great. Yeah. So definitely if you've had COVID infection, we still recommend getting vaccinated for COVID, primarily because we don't know how long the immunity from the sort of natural infection, if you will, lasts. Whereas the vaccines, we are getting sort of more and more information about how long that immunity does last. And so we do recommend in transplant patients getting fully vaccinated, even if you've had the COVID infection. In terms of whether your course will differ any from people who didn't have COVID and got vaccinated, I don't know. It is at least theoretically possible. In general, we see that people who've had COVID infection and been vaccinated, that they have quite robust sort of antibody, levels in the general population and not in the transplant setting. And so there's reason to theorize that, folks who've had the infection and the vaccine, may have, more in the way of sort of antibody response, but that's entirely speculation, and we don't know that yet. So it may be that at some point we are doing a blood test to see kind of, where people are in terms of their protection and then reacting to that. But again, we're not quite there yet because we don't really know how to interpret those antibody test results. We're still learning what correlates with protection and that sort of thing. And I guess one other thing I wanted to say that I didn't say before is that, the official sort of emergency use authorization by the FDA does not include a third vaccine shot right now. So, I definitely, cannot and do not at this point recommend a third shot, in case that wasn't clear. I'm more trying to predict what might happen with what the FDA might recommend in the future.
Got it. Okay. So
Thank you.
Again, thank you for specifically addressing it. And again, if you can address, and if you wouldn't mind doing it parallel, assume a person is a recipient and one scenario they are not a recipient. Is there a recommendation about the use of a mask by that individual if they are outdoors visiting with people? And is there a recommendation for that individual if they are indoors with fully vaccinated people? So I know there's a couple of variables. Why don't we first assume the person is a recipient? What is your recommendation about their outdoor activities and whether it matters whether the people they're with are vaccinated or not?
Yeah, so I think that outdoor activities are in general considered to be quite safe, sort of period, from a COVID point of view. And so I think that, certainly national and local guidance is that in outdoor settings, masking is probably not required, kind of regardless of vaccination status at this point. And I think, you know, if you are a transplant recipient who has been vaccinated, I think, I would feel quite comfortable with outdoor activities with or without a mask. There's a lot of it depends how crowded it is and all these sorts of things. But, if you're, if you're going for a picnic or something like that outdoors, that has been a low risk sort of endeavor. I think it's even lower risk if you're around folks who are, completely vaccinated, if those are the people that you're with.
Great. And what about then indoors?
Yeah, so indoors is a place where we are still encouraging mask use by transplants patients, unless you're obviously in your own home, with just your household. If you're, with people outside of your household, we would still recommend mask use. I think if you are indoors with a small group of people and that small group of people, is completely vaccinated, then, the risk with taking off your mask is not very high since all those people, are vaccinated. But if you're not sure of everyone's vaccination status, then we would, recommend a mask indoors.
Okay. And there was a question, and thanks again, everybody, for all your questions. We have limited time, but maybe we'll be able to offline get a reaction from Dr. Anesi on some of them. So we are hearing a lot on the news about the variants and the Delta variant. I did hear you comment on the effectiveness of the vaccines vis-a-vis these variants. Is that true for the Delta variant? And again, some of this is just to make sure everybody who understands the effectiveness of the vaccines to date.
Yeah, so far, what's been reported is that the current vaccines, and I should say by current vaccines, at least I'm aware of data for the mRNA vaccine. So for Pfizer and Moderna, I'm aware of data that suggests that they're still protective against the Delta variant. Now, there's protected, I'm making sort of a single category. And of course, it's really a spectrum. And that's a lot of what we're trying to figure out with transplant patients is where on the spectrum between completely unprotected and completely protected are you? And I think some of these variants, what we're finding is that like the Delta variant, it looks like it might be slightly less protective, but it's still well above the level that we would, hope for and consider sort of sufficient, if you will, and certainly effective at preventing severe infection in the sense of needing to go to the hospital and that kind of thing. So that has been very reassuring, though again, it may be moving the needle a little bit along that spectrum in terms of reducing the efficacy a little bit.
Okay. Great. So Judith, I'm going to switch over to just some updates for our volunteers. Thank you so much. You have been such an outstanding resource. And folks who are participating, we're going to continue to take advantage of Dr. Anesi's excellent expertise and call upon her and continue to share that with her. So Talia, if you'll forward the slide, and I want to thank Talia Giordano, Wendy Johnson, Colleen Duran, who have helped set all of this up. And again, thank you, Dr. Anesi. We are here, I said to you all in the beginning, we envision a future where we will see you in person. So as of July the 1st, folks, for our volunteers, we are looking forward to welcoming you, seeing you in person for outdoor volunteer initiatives. So that means for Gift of Life donor ambassadors who go out into the community to speak. Gift of Life is officially endorsing you in those outdoor volunteer programs, if it is a table, if it's a baseball game, if it is outdoor, speaking events, speaking at a fundraiser that is outdoors, we fully support that, and we will be making those volunteer opportunities available to you. Colleen will update you on those. Now, I know how incredibly forward-thinking so many of you volunteers are, and you're always out there looking for opportunities. So if you say, well, what does that mean? We're saying green light for outdoor July and August. If you have an opportunity in September that is an indoor one, we are suggesting that you conditionally accept it, understanding that we will continue to monitor what is going on and determine whether we can fully endorse it. But you can, we're very hopeful, so you can conditionally accept indoor volunteer opportunities, whether it is outdoor or it is indoor. It is subject to the restrictions imposed by the host venue. If the host venue says you can only do this if you are wearing a mask, that means if you participate there, you need to wear a mask, okay? That's for outdoor piece. For Gift of Life donor program. For the family house, we are welcoming outdoor volunteer programming for July and August. So yes, it means that we are going to be using the grill a lot. I am sure our home cook heroes can be incredibly creative in how many different types of outdoor barbecuing we can be doing. It will be outdoor. We are looking for outdoor evening activities. Jem, the therapy, Mary, thank you for bringing Jem over yesterday for therapy dog outdoor support. So outdoor programming, outdoor fundraising for the family house, we will support that, again, conditioned upon whatever restrictions may be there by the host venue. Other two pieces, everybody, you should consult with your own, if you are immunocompromised, you should consult with your own personal health expert, your transplant physician, to determine what is best for you, what is right for you. You have to be in charge of your personal health. When we talk about these external activities, we are not mandating masking. If you heard what Dr. Anesi recommended, and also speak with your own personal health expert. For all of our volunteers, we are likely to forward you some form of communication that lays this out, and it may ask you to acknowledge that you've read it and that you understand it. But again, July 1st, we look forward to seeing you in person. Hey, and over at the family house, it's possible that we may look for ways to do some indoor home cook heroes during the month of August. Again, it requires us to make some adjustments. We're looking at how we might be able to do that. But we're happy and thrilled to be able to greenlight some things for our shuttle service to our unbelievable shuttle drivers. We have not greenlighted that project yet. We need to continue to look at how we can balance health and transportation issues. One of our big challenges with the shuttle, folks, is the windows do not open, and we cannot provide fresh air circulation there. That's what we're trying to work on. And I see Dr. Anesi shaking her head because we have tried to whirl that one around. If you have questions, you can reach out to Colleen and Wendy. That's sort of the general landscape. I do want to take a minute now to also introduce Howard Nathan, who I see Howard's name. Howard, can you show, can we shut down the slides, Talia, so that we can have Howard be full view? Oh, thanks, Judith. And I want to, Talia, are you, do you need to take back or? let's see, I'm not seeing Howard yet. Oh, there's Howard. So we are, I am pleased, everybody, to welcome Howard. I think everybody on probably knows Howard Nathan, our president and CEO. And Howard was the visionary behind the Family House, which everybody knows we're getting ready for our kickoff, our 10th anniversary. And Howard has some a very special message to share with everybody. Judith, thank you so much for your expertise.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Judith. Good to see you. Hi, everybody. If you haven't looked at your emails, we made some big announcements today. I'm going to be stepping down as CEO at the end of the year, and Rick Hawes has been named the CEO starting January 4th. And I want to congratulate Rick. Rick's been here for the past almost 3 decades, working hard with running the clinical team, and he will become head of the Gift of Life Donor Program, the Transplant Foundation, and the Family House. Jan will continue her role as Vice President and General Counsel and continue to be the Director of the House and all of her other duties. I'll be transitioning to the foundation to continue to do fundraising and work together with Rick and Jan on the Institute with helping train other organ procurement organizations throughout the country and throughout the world, as we have been doing, sharing our best practices. But I wanted to take a moment, since I have a lot of the volunteers on the phone. I just wanted to say thank you for all of your support. All the accomplishments that we've made, really, you guys have been the powerhouse behind it. All the things that you do, the talks that you've done, the health fairs, all the volunteer work at the house. This is what makes it real for people that we come in contact with. And as I've always said, you know, transplantation, organ donation is neighbor helping neighbor. And you guys really make that real for everybody, and I appreciate it. So I just wanted to say thanks. You'll look at your emails. I'm sure you got an email from either me or Jan or somebody, and it's already in the media. If you're in Philadelphia, KYW News Radio, Philadelphia Business Journal, and some others, it's on the PR Newswire. So anyhow, thanks everybody, and I'll be seeing you. I'm not going far, but Rick's going to be in charge. So get to know Rick Hawes.
So Rick, everybody, Rick sends his thanks. He's actually on a call right now for a national collaborative where we're working with other donor programs and transplant centers across the country. So he couldn't step off right now, but we will be able to have Rick meet most of you in August for those who are going to be participating in one of our volunteer programs then. And I do want to reassure you, because I'm reading the comments, that Howard is not going far. Literally, he's going to the 4th floor. Okay. So Rick is going to be president and CEO. Howard is moving on up to the 4th floor and will really lead our training, which is, there's obviously great need for the shared best practices that have been developed here, that you all have embraced and that you all have helped us push out. So thank you to everybody. And I think that that's today's show, everybody. So everybody, thank you so much. And Talia will follow up and make sure that the resources come back out. And Judith, you know, we got you on the hook for the fall for an update.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody. We really look forward to seeing you in person.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Peace.